My father's old buckle punch fit a hole hidden inside the iron press.
He was 25 and evicted. No room, no wages, no one willing to hear him. Just a buckle punch and $12 he had hidden beneath the lining of his work boot. And with that $12, he bought a forgotten leather bookstrap shop outside Ann Arbor in Washtenaw County, Michigan, a place struck from county maps in 1978. The roof sagged above the cutting room. Rain had split the rear sill nearly through. The county condemned it on October 3, 2022, with demolition planned for the first thaw of spring. But inside the strap-cutting press, a hollow buckle punch had waited unopened for 44 years, holding the truth about the shop and the life Jude had lost. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Jude Mercer had been measuring his whole life without knowing it. As a boy in Ypsilanti, he measured days by small repairs. The week a kitchen chair stopped rocking. The winter his father patched a school satchel. The Sunday a cracked belt was cut down and given a second tongue. His father, Elias Mercer, worked with his hands even after the nerves in his left thumb began to fail. When Jude brought home a torn bookstrap from school, Elias laid it on the table as carefully as a wounded bird. On Saturdays, they took the bus to a narrow repair room behind a used bookshop on South University Avenue, where Elias's older friend, Arthur Bell, made leather carriers for students who could not afford satchels. Arthur had a white scar across one knuckle and a habit of warming brass buckles in his palm before fitting them. He taught Jude to cut along the grain, not across it, to punch every hole from the finished face so the leather would not burst outward, to dampen an edge before burnishing it with canvas. At noon, Arthur brewed coffee in a dented blue pot, while Jude swept curls of russet leather from beneath the bench. Then they chose one damaged strap from the week's basket and repaired it without charge. Arthur wrote the student's name in a black ledger. Jude drew the line through the price and closed the book. A strap does not carry books. It carries the chance to return tomorrow. Jude understood years later that Arthur was not speaking about leather. He meant that useful work could hold a person steady when pride, rent, or grief had loosened everything else. Arthur died during Jude's final year of high school, after a stroke behind the repair bench. The landlord emptied the room before Elias could reach it. The stitching horse, the edge irons, the brass templates, and the black ledger disappeared into an estate auction no one had known about. Elias kept only the old buckle punch Jude had been using that Saturday. By 25, Jude worked at a luggage repair counter inside a department store warehouse in Dearborn. Mason Lead ran the shift with a soft voice and a ring of keys that never stopped moving against his thigh. He did not shout. He changed schedules without notice, counted scraps after closing, and stood too near when asking questions he already knew the answers to. When a zipper repair went wrong, Mason placed the damaged case on Jude's bench and waited in silence until Jude apologized for work he had not done. On November 7th, Jude withdrew $640 for rent because his landlord would not accept a check. He sealed the bills in an envelope and locked them in the gray locker beside the loading dock. At lunch, the lock hung open, its latch bent inward. Mason stood behind him, turning one key around his finger. Broken locks do not make honest men careless. Exactly 8 words, delivered without heat. The warehouse manager searched Jude's coat, his toolbox, even the lining of his lunch bag. No money was found. No one searched Mason's locker. 2 days later, Jude's landlord set a green ceramic lamp on the hallway floor beside Jude's boxes because the cord had snagged while the room was being cleared. Jude's mother came from Toledo in a borrowed car. She looked at the eviction notice, then at Mason's written statement Jude had brought home. She folded the statement once, placed it under the lamp, and carried a box downstairs without saying his name. For 6 weeks, Jude moved east and west along the bus lines. He slept 2 nights in the waiting room at the Ann Arbor Transportation Center, 3 beneath a church stairwell in Ypsilanti, and 1 cold week inside an unlocked storage shed behind a shuttered florist in Belleville. In Dearborn, he slept upright in a laundromat until the owner dimmed the lights above him. $12 became $9 after soup and bread, then $6 after a bus ride, then $4.70 after he bought dry socks from a pharmacy clearance bin. He kept the buckle punch wrapped in a handkerchief inside his coat. Each morning he checked for it before checking the weather. At the downtown Ann Arbor Library, where the heat rose evenly from floor vents, Jude learned which chairs faced away from the security desk. On the 41st day, he opened a local classified sheet left beside a recycling bin. A box notice near the bottom read, "Abandoned commercial parcel. Cash transfer. Structure as is. $12 plus filing." Beneath it, in smaller type, were the words Leather Notions and Bookstrap Works. He read the notice 3 times. Then he took the buckle punch from his pocket and set it over Arthur Bell's name, which someone had penciled faintly in the margin beside the address. Jude spent his last 70 cents copying the notice. Before dusk, he washed his face in the library restroom, tightened the laces on his cracked boots, and walked toward the county offices, with the page folded against his chest. By morning, he would learn whether $12 could purchase a ruin, or whether the ruin had already been waiting for him. At 7 the next morning, Jude boarded the westbound county bus with the classified notice in one pocket and $12 pressed flat inside the other. The driver let him off beyond the last regular stop, where pavement narrowed into wet gravel and the fields lay silver under November frost. He walked 11 miles that day, following hand-painted road signs toward Ann Arbor Township, and slept in a hay barn after asking permission from no one because there was no house in sight. The temperature fell to 26 degrees. He pushed loose hay beneath his coat, kept the buckle punch against his ribs, and woke whenever mice crossed the rafters. By noon the following day, the road brought him into a small settlement north of the city, where 5 businesses stood within 2 blocks. Harlan Hardware, Doris Bell's Cafe, Mott's Shoe Repair, Greenfield Feed and Seed, and a narrow pharmacy called Wren & Son. Their windows held ordinary things: snow shovels, pie tins, heel polish, burlap sacks, and Jude slowed before each one because ordinary commerce had begun to feel like evidence of shelter. The county clerk's office occupied the first floor of a limestone building behind a war memorial. Inside, radiators knocked beneath tall windows, and the air smelled faintly of damp wool and carbon paper. Jude removed his cap before approaching the counter. The woman behind it wore a silver thimble on a chain around her neck. Her nameplate read, "Mrs. Evelyn Parrish." She examined the notice, then Jude's boots, then the 12 $1 bills he placed in a careful row. "You understand the structure has no certified water supply?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the electrical service was disconnected in 1981? "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the rear foundation has shifted 4 inches? "Yes, ma'am." "You understand demolition may proceed if you fail inspection by April?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Parrish drew the deed from a green folder and turned it toward him. The parcel description ran through half a page of measurements, beginning at an iron pin beside an old walnut, and ending at a drainage creek Jude had never seen. He signed beneath the former owner's name. She pressed a brass county stamp into a violet pad, brought it down with both hands, and held at it there until the paper gave a dry, fibrous creak. "Take Pontiac Trail north," she said. "Turn right on Warren Road, then left where the pavement breaks beside a red mailbox without a door. The lane is nearly a mile. When you see 2 walnut trees leaning away from each other, you are there." She began counting the bills, but stopped at the surname on his signature. Mercer. Jude looked up. Mrs. Parrish opened a drawer and removed an index card browned along one edge. Arthur Bell brought the man named Elias Mercer here in 1994. They asked about this same parcel. The radiator struck once beneath the window. My father, Jude said. He never bought it. She read the card again. They inspected the building, paid a records fee, and left before closing. Mr. Bell said the shop belonged to someone who had kept students supplied during hard years. Your father said he would return when he had enough. Jude touched the counter with 2 fingers, as though steadying a board before a cut. Elias had never spoken of the parcel. He had spoken of Arthur's repair room, of student straps and worn buckles, but never of a shop beyond the city where the work had begun. Mrs. Parrish folded the receipt around one of Jude's dollar bills and placed it in her desk drawer. You have paid $12, she said. The filing fee was waived under the Condemned Property Transfer Program. I thought the notice said plus filing. It did. Her hand remained on the closed drawer. Outside, the afternoon had turned colder. Jude followed Pontiac Trail until traffic thinned, then took Warren Road past drainage ditches filmed with ice. A woman in a brown coat watched from the porch of a farmhouse, while her black and white dog stood in the yard with one front paw raised. The dog barked only once. Beyond them, walnut trees leaned over the lane, their bare branches knitting across the pale sky. The shop appeared slowly through brush. It was a 1.5-story building of dark red brick over a fieldstone base, perhaps 24 feet wide and 40 feet deep. The roof had once been cedar shake, but now showed patches of rusted metal and black felt. A narrow chimney rose from the west wall, with 3 bricks missing near the cap. Above the front windows hung a wooden sign so weathered that only book straps could still be read, the letters cut deep enough to hold rainwater. Jude stood beneath it until cold passed through the soles of his boots. The front door resisted at the sill. He leaned his shoulder into it, heard old paint tear, and stepped into a room where dust softened every edge. The air tasted of dry plaster and mouse nests. Leather straps hung from pegs along one wall, curled hard as bark, their brass buckles green with age. When he lifted one, it gave off the faint animal smell of old tack warmed by a hand. A glass display case occupied the center of the front room. Beneath its cloudy top lay paper labels, a broken ruler, and 3 narrow straps still wrapped in brown tissue. Wind moved through a crack behind the counter and touched the back of his neck. Somewhere inside the wall, something scratched twice and became still. The rear room held the work. A long cutting bench stood beneath 2 north-facing windows. Beside it was a strap-cutting press with a cast-iron wheel, its handle locked halfway through a turn. Dust covered the machine, but the edge of its blade remained dark and exact. Jude placed his palm against the bench. The wood was cold enough to ache through his skin. He found a hand pump outside, worked it until brown water coughed from the spout, and let it run until the stream cleared. He drank from his cupped hands. The water carried an iron taste and a clean depth that made his empty stomach tighten. Near dusk, he swept one section of floor with a bundle of dry grass. He ate the last heel of bread from his coat pocket and listened to the building settle. Each sound had a location: a loose pane tapping in front, a roof board lifting over the rear room, the slow complaint of the east wall when the wind pressed it. He chose a place beside the cutting bench because the floorboards there felt firm. His coat became a blanket, his folded cap a pillow. Before lying down, he removed the buckle punch and set it on the bench within reach. Moonlight entered through the broken window and rested on the old press. For a moment, the iron wheel appeared almost polished, though Jude knew it was only frost-colored light moving across dust. He could smell leather, cold ashes, and the mineral damp of stone below him. The building did not feel welcoming. It felt watchful. Jude closed his hand around the deed and listened until the shop's separate noises became one slow, breathing sound around him. What had been kept in silence was still waiting to be carried. On the first morning, Jude carried a dented pail to the hand pump and worked the handle until his shoulders warmed. The well gave clear water after 30 strokes, though rust stained the pail in a thin orange ring. Behind the shop, he found an outhouse leaning toward the creek, its door held shut by baling wire. He reset the hinge with a stone and learned to step over the second board, which had softened around the nails. By the third day, the floor had taught him its language. The front room creaked sharply near the display case. The hall answered with 2 lower notes. In the workroom, a plank beside the press remained silent, no matter where he placed his weight. He marked the reliable paths with chalk so he could cross the shop after dark without testing each board. Harlan hardware smelled of lamp oil, rope, and the iron dust that settled beneath key-cutting machines. Its owner, Silas Harlan, had one eyebrow burned white from an old furnace flare. He listened while Jude asked the price of a chimney brush, then looked past him at the sleet whitening the street. "You bought the Bellstrap shop," Jude nodded. Silas opened a ledger behind the counter. "I can give you 30 days. I do not have wages coming." "Then give me your word coming." Jude signed beneath the date. Silas added a thin book with a cracked yellow cover titled Home Repairs for Farm and Shop. "No charge," he said. "The pages on roofs lie. The chimney pages mostly don't." Jude bought a 6-inch wire flue brush for $4.80, 20 feet of rope for $1.40, a canvas drop cloth for $2.10, stove cement for $1.95, and a box of safety matches for 12 cents. Silas wrote every price in the ledger, including the matches. Back at the shop, Jude spread the canvas beneath the chimney cleanout and tied the brush to the rope with 2 half hitches backed by a square knot. The ladder would not safely reach the roof, so he removed the small iron stovepipe inside and worked upward from the hearth. He pushed the brush as far as his arm allowed, drew it down, rotated it a quarter turn, and repeated. The first fall of creosote sounded like dry grain striking canvas. By the second hour, soot had blackened the lines of his hands. A hardened glaze blocked the flue above the smoke shelf, too smooth for the brush to bite. Jude wrapped a narrow chain around the bristles to give them weight, then worked the rope in strokes no longer than a foot. Each pull loosened another brittle plate. The pieces came down curved like black pottery and smelled sharp enough to sting his eyes. He stopped twice to carry debris outside. At the 5th hour, the brush passed through the obstruction and rose another 6 feet. Cold air moved down the chimney and lifted soot from the hearth in a soft spiral. Jude sealed 2 gaps in the pipe collar with stove cement and waited until evening before testing the draw. He twisted newspaper beneath 3 dry walnut sticks, struck 1 match, and held it near the throat. The flame leaned inward. The fire caught slowly. Smoke hesitated beneath the lintel, then rose cleanly through the flue. Heat spread across the bricks and reached Jude's face with such plain generosity that he sat on the floor rather than move away. He heated water in a coffee tin, added a potato. Doris Bell had slipped into his coat pocket at the cafe and cut it with Arthur's buckle punch because he owned no knife. The pieces cooked with salt Silas had poured into a paper twist. Jude ate from the tin while the stove ticked beside him. The following morning he began examining the workroom. He found a rosewood edge slicker, worn dark at its center, a brass compass with 1 leg bent, 2 round knives buried in a drawer of hardened wax, and a stitching pony whose jaw still held a strip of unfinished cowhide. Beneath the bench lay a jar of copper rivets, sealed by corrosion. A narrow shelf carried 7 wooden buckle patterns, each marked with a student's initials rather than a size. On the wall hung a linen apron stiff with age, its pocket containing 3 curls of beeswax and a tram ticket dated April 1978. The strap-cutting press stood apart from these things, too heavy to shift and too complete to dismiss. Its cast iron frame was bolted through the floor. A guide fence ran beside the blade, allowing long hides to be cut into equal widths, but the wheel remained frozen halfway through its arc. Jude brushed away dust and found that the axle had been greased before the shop closed. Rust covered the surface, yet the bearings beneath it turned a fraction when he leaned his full weight against the handle. He tapped the frame with the wooden handle of the buckle punch. The iron answered with a dense, even note. At the base, the sound changed. He tapped again. The left side rang solid. The right returned a shorter sound, almost wooden. Jude knelt and pressed both palms against the frame. One side felt colder than the other. The difference was slight. It was exact. He removed 2 floor bolts with penetrating oil borrowed from Silas and placed a fence post beneath the press as a lever. The left side lifted less than half an inch. The right rose quickly, as though part of its weight had been carried by something hidden below. Jude lowered it and searched the frame with his fingertips. Behind the guide fence, grease concealed the rim of a circular plug no wider than his palm. He scraped it clean with the bent leg of the brass compass. The plug was cedar, stained black to resemble iron, and fitted so closely that no edge could be caught by a fingernail. At its center was a hole shaped for a buckle punch. Jude looked toward the tool lying on the bench. Arthur's punch entered the opening without resistance. When Jude turned it clockwise, the cedar disc moved 1/8 of an inch and stopped. He pushed inward, turned again, and heard a spring release inside the press. The disc came forward into his hand. Behind it was a narrow chamber running through the iron base. Jude did not reach inside at once. He swept the bench, washed the soot from his hands, and closed the workroom door against the wind. Then he lit the oil lamp, set the cedar disc beside it, and drew out the first package. It was wrapped in oiled linen and tied with waxed thread. Inside lay an 8-inch draw gauge with a walnut handle, its blade protected by folded paper. The second package held 2 pricking irons, 6 and 8 teeth, along with a bone folder polished to the color of cream. A third contained narrow rolls of vegetable-tanned leather, still pliable beneath their waxed paper despite the decades. The final object would not pass through this opening. Jude inserted 2 fingers, found a wire handle, and turned the object sideways. A rectangular tin box slid forward with a slow scrape. Its lid bore no name, only a small stamped mark of 2 crossed straps. He placed it on the bench. The hinge resisted. Jude warmed it above the stove, touched 1 drop of oil to each end, and waited until the metal cooled. The lid opened without breaking. Bank drafts filled the upper half, bound in packets by paper bands from 3 Michigan banks. Beneath them lay a cloth purse, a military medal, and a black student ledger, swollen by damp, but still legible. Jude counted the drafts first. He read each figure aloud and wrote it on the back page of the repair manual. 500, 1,000, 200, another 1,000. Some carried dates from the 1950s, others from the final months of the shop. When the first count reached $41,800, he began again from the opposite end. The total did not change. The cloth purse contained $37.63. Indian head cents darkened almost black. Buffalo nickels worn smooth across the animal's shoulder. Silver mercury dimes. And 6 Walking Liberty $half, wrapped separately in cotton. The metal beneath them was a purple heart engraved to Thomas Bell, 1944. Jude set it apart from the money. Last, he opened the ledger. Its pages recorded names, repairs, materials, and amounts. Many lines ended with "paid later." Others carried no amount at all, only a note in the margin. Father ill, winter tuition due, scholarship delayed, books too heavy for twine. Arthur's ritual had not begun in the room behind the used bookshop. It had been inherited from here. Between the ledger's final pages rested an envelope addressed in faded blue ink. My dear one, whoever you are. Jude held it near the lamp, but did not break the seal. Night had gathered outside while he counted. He carried the envelope and metal to the front room, then stopped. The shop felt smaller with the knowledge inside it, and the money felt less like rescue than a question placed carefully in his hands. He put on his coat and walked behind the building to the creek. Ice had formed along the edges, leaving a narrow channel in the middle, where black water moved under the moon. He watched a walnut leaf travel beneath the surface until darkness took it beyond the bend. The letter remained unopened inside his coat. What had been kept in silence was still waiting to be carried. At first light, Jude carried the envelope back to the workbench. The blue ink had faded at the edges, but the long, downward stroke in the letter M was one he knew. Arthur Bell had formed it the same way in every repair tag Jude had swept from beneath his bench. The handwriting was older here, less steady, yet unmistakable. He warmed his hands over the stove before opening the seal. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the press has accepted the old punch, and someone remembered enough to work slowly. Dr. Miriam Feld at University Hospital in Ann Arbor told me in February that the pain in my bones is multiple myeloma. She said the treatment may buy time, though not the kind of time required to put this shop in order. I am writing in the evenings because my hands are strongest after supper, and because silence has weight when a room has held it too long. The Bell trade began with Samuel Bell, born in 1841 near Adrian, Michigan, who cut harness straps for Union cavalry remounts during the Civil War. His daughter Clara Bell, born in 1878, brought the tools to Ann Arbor in 1899 and began making book carriers for women entering the university. Clara's son Edwin, born in 1905, moved the shop to this building during the winter of 1928. I, Margaret Clara Bell, born here in 1919, inherited the bench, the press, and the obligation to keep useful things within reach of people whose money had run out. My husband, Thomas Bell, was killed in France in August 1944. The Purple Heart in the tin came home without him. Our son Arthur was 4 years old. He grew up beneath this bench, learned every blade, and later opened a smaller repair room in town when my illness made the road difficult. The trade closed on April 17, 1978. For more than 30 years, I have heard no cutting wheel turn here. Still, the work must be left in a condition that does not punish the next pair of hands. Keep the draw gauge blade at 20 degrees. Dampen strap edges with 1 part beeswax to 2 parts tallow, and burnish before the leather dries. When fitting brass, warm the buckle no hotter than 120 degrees. Then let it rest 10 minutes before setting the rivet. Punch holes 1 inch apart for school bundles, but shorten the interval to 3/4 of an inch when the books exceed 12 pounds. Do not hurry old leather. It will tell you where it can bend. The drafts are not wages, and they are not a reward for finding them. They came from years when families paid late, then returned later with more than they owed. I save the excess because tuition crises arrive quietly. The ledger will show you who received straps without charge. Some finished school, some did not. The work was still worth doing. Inheritance is not the money, nor the building, nor even these tools. It is the knowledge that a careful hand can keep another person from dropping what must be carried. Use what is needed. Preserve what is not. Leave instructions better than the ones you received. Behind the back door, beneath the west walnut, you will find Thomas's stone marker. Light the small brass lamp for him once. Arthur always meant to do it with me, but illness has shortened the road between intention and ending. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Margaret Clara Bell, November 2nd, 1981. Jude read the letter twice. The second time, he stopped at Arthur's name and placed his thumb against the paper without moving it. Then he folded the sheets along their original creases, returned them to the envelope, and laid it beside the Purple Heart. Outside, frost had silvered the weeds behind the shop. Jude cleared vines from the back door and crossed to the western walnut, where the ground rose slightly near the roots. Beneath 6 inches of wet leaves, his boot struck stone. He knelt and uncovered a low granite marker carved with Thomas Edwin Bell, 1916 to 1944. A narrow line beneath the dates read, "He carried others first." The small brass lamp stood on a shelf above the stitching pony, blackened by old oil. Jude cleaned the wick tube with thread, filled the reservoir from a bottle found beneath the counter, and polished one pane with his sleeve. At dusk, he carried it outside and set it upon the marker. The flame trembled once, then steadied behind the glass. He remained there until the cold reached his knees. On the walk back inside, he remembered the people who had carried him without asking for proof that he deserved it. The laundromat owner in Dearborn, who had dimmed only half the lights. The Belleville florist, who had left the storage shed latch unhooked after seeing him near the alley. Silas Harlan, who wrote debt beside Jude's name but spoke of it as trust. Mrs. Parrish, who folded one of his dollars into a receipt and kept it in her drawer. Even Doris Bell's potato had become part of the first warm meal in the shop. Perhaps you remember such a kindness in your own life. Not a rescue announced with ceremony, but a door left open, a meal placed within reach, or one person who trusted you before there was evidence. What small kindness once helped you continue? Jude carried the lamp indoors after the flame exhausted its oil. He placed the draw gauge, the pricking irons, Arthur's buckle punch, and Margaret's letter in a row beside his blanket. The metal remained above them, resting on folded linen. That night, he slept with the heirlooms close enough to touch, while the first snow began tapping softly against the north windows. The first measurable snow fell on December 2nd, 6 inches by noon, settling into the roof's hollow places and showing Jude exactly where the structure had surrendered. He read the roofing chapter in Silas's manual 3 times beside the stove, then climbed only high enough to measure from the ladder. 2 roof planes, each 26 by 16 feet. Allowing 10% for waste, he calculated 9 squares of cedar shingles, 3 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 22 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Silas studied the figures and removed a roofing hatchet from beneath the counter. Its leather grip had been replaced with wrapped cord. My brother used this 30 years. I cannot buy it. You aren't buying it. A former roofer named Orson Pike arrived the next morning in a canvas coat, polished at the elbows. He was 71, with one ear folded from an old fall and a carpenter's pencil tucked behind it. He looked at the roof, spat into the snow, and refused the money Jude did not have. They sistered the split rafter with a straight length of pine, bolting it beyond the damaged section at both ends. Orson snapped a blue chalk line across the felt and showed Jude how to set each nail with 3 strokes. 1 to place it, 1 to drive, 1 to seat. That nail's proud. Jude raised the hatchet. Pull it. For 11 days they worked beneath a sky the color of unglazed clay. Jude learned to keep his knees below the course line and his weight over soundwood. Snow melted against his gloves, then froze at the cuffs. Orson spoke only when a measurement mattered. On December 14th, they fixed the final ridge cap. From the lane, the new cedar lay in even-shadowed rows, plain and deliberate. Jude climbed down after Orson and looked up without searching for the next failure. January exposed what the first fire had hidden. Bricks near the chimney crown had begun to spall, shedding thin red faces whenever frost entered them, and the mortar beneath could be rubbed into powder between 2 fingers. Jude dismantled the damaged courses one brick at a time, marking each sound piece in chalk. Silas supplied hydraulic lime and fire clay on credit. For the joints nearest the flue, Jude mixed 3 parts washed sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, and 1/2 part fire clay, adding water slowly until the mortar held the print of his thumb without shining. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that rarely rose above 28 degrees. He built a windbreak from feed sacks and warmed the bricks beside the stove before carrying them up. Bare hands gave him better control, but they went numb every 15 minutes. He descended, held them near the fire until pain returned, then climbed again. He packed the joints in 2 lifts so the mortar would not slump, raked each seam back a 1/4 inch, and brushed it only after the surface lost its wet sheen. At night, he covered the new work with damp burlap beneath a sheet of canvas, protecting the cure from frost. On January 27th, Orson stood in the yard while Jude lit a test fire. A gray thread rose above the rebuilt crown, straightened in the wind, and disappeared. Inside, no smoke entered the room. The draw was clean enough to pull the match flame sideways from 6 inches away. Jude let the fire burn low and listened to the chimney warm without cracking. Beneath the grime, the floors were white pine fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails. Jude set every raised head with a narrow punch before renting a random orbit sander from Silas for $14 a day. The machine pulled hard toward the walls, and on the first pass, it nearly carried him into the display case. He sanded with 80 grit to remove the blackened finish, then 120 to erase the coarse circles, and finally 220 along the grain by hand, near every threshold. Between passes, he swept twice and wiped the boards with a barely damp cloth. The wood emerged uneven but alive, marked by chair legs, dropped tools, and one long scar beside the press that he chose not to erase. He rubbed in the first oil coat with folded cotton, waited until the thirsty board stopped dulling, and wiped away the excess. 2 more coats followed, each thinner than the last. Then he closed the room for a 48-hour cure. The floor shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, wherever old hands and boots had compressed its fibers. Morning light moved across it, without glare. One day, he did nothing. He had woken before dawn with his father's silence pressing harder than the work. Jude carried his coat to the marsh and sat on a fallen trunk. A great blue heron stood in shallow water, one leg hidden, its body so still that drifting ice passed without disturbing it. Jude watched until the bird opened its wings and lifted above the reeds. He returned after sunset and left the sander untouched. The next morning, he finished the haul. 8 windows faced the weather. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked, and 1 held a wavering original pane dated in the old glazing records to 1788, salvaged from an earlier building and reset when the shop was raised. Jude preserved that pane exactly as it was, bubbles and all. He removed the damaged sash, labeled every piece, and softened the old putty beneath a cloth, warmed near the stove. For the new panes, he rolled DAP 33 glazing putty between his palms, pressed a thin bedding line into each rabbet, and lowered the glass without forcing the corners. Glazier's points went in every 8 inches. The finish bead was drawn with a putty knife, held at a low angle, so the edge met the sight line of the muntin. The counterweights had fallen inside 2 frames. Jude opened the pockets, vacuumed out mouse nests with a hand bellows, and replaced the broken rope with 1/4 inch cotton sash cord. He tied each weight using a figure-8 knot, seated the knot deep in its recess, then tested the sash through 10 full rises before closing the pocket. The work demanded patience more than strength. Putty tore when his knife was dry and wrinkled when he pressed too quickly. He scraped away 3 poor beads and began them again. On the final window, he set the upper sash and drew the cord until the frame balanced without drifting. Outside, a chickadee landed on the nearest walnut branch. It turned its black-capped head toward the glass, tapped once at a swelling bud, and remained while Jude lowered the sash into place. The walls near the chimney were horsehair plaster laid over hand-split oak lath, and they resisted every shortcut Jude attempted. His first patch cracked overnight. The second sagged from the keys. The third dried too quickly beside the stove and separated with a hollow sound when tapped. Silas found an old feed bag of horsehair in his brother's barn. Jude washed it in warm water, spread it near the stove, and cut the strands short enough to disappear into the mix. He laid a scored scratch coat first, pressing lime plaster through the lath until firm keys formed behind it. After it stiffened, he added a 3/8-inch brown coat and left it 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The finished coat went on 1/8 inch thick, worked with a wooden float until the surface held the slight unevenness of the original wall. Jude stood back from the final patch. It did not conceal its age, it joined it. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Bell began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before dawn. She was a broad-shouldered woman with flour caught permanently in the seams of her hands. The bags held biscuits, boiled eggs, or the end pieces of roast beef from the cafe. Jude carried the first empty bag back and placed 2 coins beside the register. Doris pushed them toward him without looking up. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." She folded the bag flat and used it to wrap a slice of apple cake. A week later, Caleb Mott arrived on a red Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a fence rail, with one bootlace replaced by twine. Without asking, he split the walnut rounds stacked beside the shed and arranged the pieces bark side up beneath the eaves. When Jude offered payment, Caleb shook his head. "My mother said, 'About your grandfather.'" He did not explain what she had said. He returned the following Saturday with wedges and worked until the light failed. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his way to the small Methodist church beyond the crossroads. His coat had velvet patches at both elbows, and he tipped his hat whether Jude was on the roof, in the doorway, or kneeling beside a frozen drain. One morning, he stopped while Jude struggled to lift a new lintel stone. "May strong hands stay gentle." Then he placed one ungloved hand beneath the stone and helped raise it into position. Jude postponed the cellar until February 11th, when the ground outside had frozen hard enough to stop water from entering beneath the east wall. 7 granite steps descended from the workroom into a 12 by 15-foot chamber with a fieldstone floor. The air smelled of wet earth and iron. At the center lay a dressed granite slab, fitted more carefully than the stones around it. Its surface bore the carved mark of 2 crossed book straps. Jude brushed the grooves clean, but did not lift the slab. Under the 3rd step, his fingers found a small oak box wedged between stone and joist. The lid had swollen shut. He carried it upstairs, wrapped it in a damp cloth, and waited until the grain relaxed. Inside lay a brass key. Its bow had been shaped into 2 crossing straps, joined by a tiny buckle. Beneath it rested a tintype from 1903. A young woman stood outside the shop before the walnut trees had thickened. She held a draw gauge at her side and looked directly into the camera. Her narrow mouth, deep-set eyes, and uneven left eyebrow were so like Jude's that he set the photograph down before picking it up again. On the back, written in brown ink, were the words Clara Bell, daughter of Samuel Bell, age 25, summer of 1903. Jude placed the key on the mantel beside Margaret's letter. He tried it in the doors, the display case, the tin box, and every drawer that still had a lock. It opened none of them. There it remained. Snow retreated from the south wall in gray folds. The creak grew loud enough to hear from the cutting bench, and pale walnut catkins appeared where the chickadee had waited in February. Jude had enough tools to begin making book straps, but he did not begin the full trade that spring. Margaret's instructions deserved more than memory and need. He chose one worn Walking Liberty $50 and exchanged it for narrow strips of vegetable tanned leather, a small tin of tallow, and 3 plain brass buckles. He practiced cutting to grain, first on scraps no wider than his thumb. He ruined edges, misplaced holes, and learned how quickly damp leather remembered a careless hand. The remaining coins stayed in the cloth purse. The house was patient, so was he. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Jude finished the first bookstrap he was willing to place beneath the glass counter. The leather was chestnut bridle hide, cut 1 inch wide with Margaret's draw gauge. He beveled both edges, rubbed them with beeswax and tallow, and burnished until they darkened without becoming glossy. The holes were spaced 1 inch apart. A plain brass buckle sat square at the end, held by 2 hand-peened rivets. Jude loaded the strap with 5 heavy books from Doris's cafe shelf and left them hanging overnight. In the morning, nothing had shifted. He wrote the date beneath the counter in pencil. The restored shop remained modest. The floors bore their old scars. Lime plaster softened the walls without making them straight, and the wavering pane from 1788 bent winter light across the display case. Arthur's buckle punch hung beside the press. Margaret's letter rested in a shallow walnut frame where Jude could remove it without unfolding the paper unnecessarily. The brass key remained on the mantel until a storm broke a limb from the western walnut. While cutting the damaged branch, Jude noticed a green metal plate embedded deep in the trunk, nearly swallowed by decades of growth. He cleaned its edges with a toothbrush and found a keyhole beneath the moss. The brass key turned once. A narrow compartment opened within the tree. Inside was a folded 48-star American flag, protected by waxed canvas, and a note written by Clara Bell in April 1918 while American soldiers were fighting in France during the First World War. She had written that the flag belonged to her younger brother Samuel Jr., who died of influenza at Camp Custer before his unit sailed overseas. Their father had not been able to bury it with him. Clara placed it in the walnut because the tree had been planted on the day Samuel enlisted, and because living wood seemed a more honest place than a locked drawer. She asked whoever found it to unfold the flag once in daylight, then keep it dry. Jude carried it to the yard on a clear morning. Doris held one corner, Caleb another, and Reverend Boyd the third. No one spoke while the faded stars opened in the cold. They folded it again along the old creases. The Purple Heart, engraved to Thomas Bell, was taken to Washtenaw Memorial Park on August 15, 2025, the 81st anniversary of his death in France. Jude placed it beneath Thomas's name for 1 hour, then returned it to the shop before rain arrived. There was no ceremony, only Reverend Boyd, Doris, and the soft clicking of insects in the cemetery grass. Jude used 4 coins from the purse. 1 bought his first leather. A second paid for replacement teeth in the smallest pricking iron. The third purchased lamp oil for Thomas's marker. The fourth bought a sheet of archival paper for the letter Jude would eventually write. He returned the drafts to this tin box, added the ledger, and wrapped everything in new oiled linen. On the inside of the lid, he wrote in careful block letters, "For the next one, use only what keeps the work alive." The tin went back into their chamber inside the press. Arthur's buckle punch closed the cedar disc with a small, exact turn. The shop reopened without a sign in the newspaper. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard. Book straps and quiet repairs. Mercer and Bell. Works Warren Road. Saturdays. The first customer was a nursing student whose textbooks had split the bottom of a canvas bag. Jude made her a plain carrier and wrote the cost in the ledger. She paid half and promised the rest after her next hospital shift. Jude drew a line through the amount. By spring, more than 40 names filled a mailing list kept in a cigar box beside the register. Some asked for repairs. Others wanted straps for family Bibles, field guides, music folios, or the heavy law books students still carried, despite the screens in their pockets. Caleb returned in June, carrying a hand-carved walnut sign wrapped in an old bedsheet. He had grown broad through the shoulders, though the same twine remained on one work boot. The sign read, "Mercer and Bell Book. Straps and repair," beneath the final line, in smaller letters. Caleb had carved, and daughters. Jude ran his thumb across the fresh cuts. "There aren't any daughters," he said. Caleb leaned the sign against the counter. There weren't any customers either. They hung it above the door that afternoon. The name was not a prediction. It was room left open. During the third winter, Jude sat at Margaret's bench after closing and placed a blank sheet of archival paper beneath the lamp. He sharpened a pencil, tested the point against the margin, and began with the words she had given him. "My dear one, whoever you are." He wrote that the roof had been repaired, the chimney drew clean, and the old pane still held. He described the proper angle for the draw-gauge blade and warned that winter air could make bridal leather feel drier than it was. He recorded Doris's bags, Caleb's sign, Reverend Boyd's forward prayer, and the nursing student whose books had been too heavy for canvas. He did not write about being saved. He wrote about being trusted with work. Before folding the letter, Jude added that anyone opening the press should take time to learn the floor's creaks. The silent plank beside the machine was still the safest place to stand. What had been kept in silence was still waiting to be carried. He placed his letter behind Margaret's, closed the tin box, and turned the cedar disc until it sat flush with the cast iron frame. Outside, snow settled on the new sign. Jude extinguished the stove, tested the front latch, and walked down the lane while the shop darkened behind him, one window at a time. The leather bookstrap shop waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's office, Mrs. Parrish retired the following spring. While clearing her desk, she found a $1 bill folded inside an old condemned property receipt. Jude's name appeared beneath the violet stamp. She did not spend it. The new clerk placed the bill back in the same drawer, where it remained beside the records of properties no one had yet chosen to carry.